Hi there everyone, FoxyFern here, and today we're going to learn how to animate a hopping squirrel in Maya. I'm just going to run you through a bit of my process that I use to tackle an animation like this. And today we're using this squirrel rig here that you can download for free at the Animation Mentor website, and you can find the link down below in the description. So I have a very basic scene set up here right now. What I've done is I just opened a brand new scene in Maya, and I always like to reference my characters in case I do something wrong to them, or if I want to change something about the character, I can go into the reference file and change something there, and then it will update in any files that I have this character. So I think it's just good practice to always reference the rigs that you're using. So we have a rig reference here in our scene, and I just put down a basic plane so that we can see where our ground is and threw that on a layer and referenced it so that I can't accidentally select it. I also set up a camera here for a view that is always going to be locked into this position. And in fact, I'm going to turn off everything except the polygons here so that we have a clean view of this character without its controls. And that's not completely necessary, but I like to do that just to see if I'm doing a specific action in a scene. That way it's going to give me a consistent preview of what it looks like. But in general, I'm going to be animating in my perspective view so that it's easy to look around. I am animating on 30 frames per second. There are a lot of animations done on 24 frames per second. That's usually in film. Games is usually 30 frames per second. And since my background is animating in games, that's what I'm used to. If any of the stuff that I'm talking about is like over your head, or you want me to elaborate more on it in another video, feel free to leave a suggestion down in the comments below, and I'll take a look at that and I'll consider making another video. It's hard for me to know exactly how much information anyone watching this video understands, so I don't want to over-explain, but I also don't want to under-explain. So if something's not clear, please, by all means, ask me, and I'll either try to answer your question in the comments, or I might make a follow-up video if there's enough of a demand for it. So the first thing I like to do with all of my characters that I'm working with is make some shelf buttons. If they don't come with a custom shelf with the rig, which this one does not, I like to make some basic shelf buttons. And again, if you want me to go into detail on explaining how to do that, by all means, let me know. But right now, I just have 3 basic buttons set up here. I have this button, which will select all of the controls available on this character. And then I have a button that will select just the body controls, and a button that will select just the tail controls. So that way, I don't have to go in here if I'm animating the tail and select one by one by one. It's just a huge time saver, and it's such a simple thing to set up. So the first thing I always do when starting an animation is I make sure to grab all of the rig controls and save a key on -1. And why is that? Because I might do something where I accidentally break the rig and I can't remember what the default position is. And because there's animation everywhere in the scene, I don't know how to go back to the default. And not every rig is set up for you to just go to the bind pose. And for instance, on this character, if you select these tail controls here, you can see that this is the default position, and this is not actually zeroed out in the default position. If I select the tail and I put all of these rotations to 0, then the tail is straight like that, which is okay, but I want it to be in the natural position that this character starts in. My first step of the animation process is always to block out where I want the character to go and the timing that I am anticipating it to be. And it's not something that you have to stick to forever, but I like to have a basic idea of what my character is going to do during the scene and how long the scene is going to be. So I have the camera set up here to where this is where I'm going to have the squirrel do his little motion. So he's going to hop in a couple times, and then he's going to stop and notice you there watching him. So yes, we're breaking the fourth wall. And then he's going to quickly run away and do a couple little quick hops off the screen. So that's my idea for this squirrel. It's basically like a more advanced level of the bouncing ball because he's going to have a little bit of character to him. And there's also a tail on there, so we get to animate that tail and have some nice overlapping motion that we wouldn't normally have with a bouncing ball. Now, this character rig is super fun, and I recommend, even if you're not going to do a fully fleshed out animation with it, to go download it and check it out, play around with it. It's a lot of fun because you can see here he's got all sorts of squash and stretch abilities. It's really cool. And then we can even like move his little mouth up and down, wiggle his ears. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. We're going to go ahead and block this out. I like to animate with my auto key turned on, so that way anytime I move this character, that key is going to save there. So that's just a personal preference. It's not something that you have to do. But I do like to work in auto key because the number of times that I've moved a character to a position that I really like and forgotten about it when I move on to another frame and then I lose that pose, it's a bad story. So one thing I am going to do here is turn on this character's ability to be moved by the sea. As you can see, I can't just like move him around right now. I have to swap out this control here. Where did it go? Aha, there it is. Okay, so if you're following along and you want to figure out how to do this, if you grab this base control here, and over in the channel box, you see gimbal cog. You can turn that on, and now you can select this control here, which will allow you to move the squirrel around instead of just his little butt area. One thing I'm going to do right away here is actually turn the tail off because we are going to animate the tail at some point, but I don't want to be distracted by the tail right now. Fortunately, the rig has a control built in for it. In that same spot, there's a tail viz button, and you can just go ahead and slide that, and it will turn off for us. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pose out this squirrel in our blocking stage. Alright guys, here we have it. This is our blocking phase. You can see the little squirrel hops in. He's gonna be all casual, huh? Oh crap! And then he heads off screen. So this is our basic blocking phase where we have just like the rough timing and the rough placement and all that. You can see it's not a very good animation yet, but this is a starting point. What I'm going to do at this point is really sort of nail down the mechanics of the hopping. And right now, all of his movement is on spline curves here. So you can see we've got all of our curves. They're very symmetrical, and there's not a lot of interest in the movement. The first thing we want to do is make sure to give our character weight. So I'm going to go into the Translate Y channel here. And we have to think about gravity. So when an object is hitting the ground, it's accelerating faster and faster and faster until boom, it finally hits the ground. And you don't want to see a slowdown before that object hits the ground because it's like maybe if it had some wind resistance or something that's slowing it down or a parachute, that would make sense. But with our character, they're just going to accelerate till they hit the ground, and then they're going to squash down because the top part of their body is still following. When an object is in motion, it wants to stay in motion. So that's what we're going to focus on first here. So you can see our Y translation, the up and down graph. In this curve, it's slowing down. So the first thing we want to do here is take all of these spots where our character hits the ground, and we want to turn them into broken tangents. And then I'm going to grab this and move our curve so that it's going to accelerate and decelerate very quickly. So now you can already see by watching this that our character has a lot of like it's coming down very quickly. In fact, in some of these cases, it might be a little too quickly. I think once we add our squash and stretch, we might want to let our character rest on the ground a little more. And I think the timing of this first jump here is 12 frames from the peak to the base, and this one is, let's see, it's 7 frames from the peak to the base. That's actually okay, but you can see these curves don't quite look similar in the shape of them. So I might go like this a little bit, make him jump higher on that second curve here. Let's see how that looks. And the other thing that's a little strange is our translate Z. He's moving along the Z axis, and that's another thing. When you're in the air, you can't slow down the amount that you're moving forward. It's mostly going to be a constant speed, again, without taking into consideration wind resistance. So what we want to do with the translate Z is between when he's in the air and when he hits the ground here, I'm going to remove this key and turn this into a linear motion. And then again, when he jumps and lands, I'm going to turn this into a linear motion. And for now, we're just going to focus on the first hop. We've got these other hops too that we can give the same treatment to, but for now, let's just change our time slider here to about 50 frames. And then we can see already it has a lot more feeling of weight and proper motion than it did before. It's more interesting. But I'm realizing now that when he's on his second hop here, he's going kind of high. Like, it's okay that he's coming in from off the screen, but at this point, he's the focus of our attention now, and we don't really want him to go off screen. Plus, eventually there's going to be a tail on there, and the tail is definitely going to be off screen, which is okay a little bit, but the character itself, it's really reaching the edge there. So I'm going to bring him down a bit on his height, and then we will adjust the curves appropriately. I do still think that maybe this curve is going to be a little bit long in time for the character's jump. Let's see what this looks like now. I think that feels a lot better, but we do need to make sure to also adjust his translate and Z because he's starting to move forward before he actually takes off the ground, which we don't want. All right, well, let's add some, let's see, what should we do first? Should we do some rotation or some squash and stretch? I think we're going to do squash and stretch because that's a fun one. I'm going to move aside my graph editor and we'll take a look at that in a minute. So this little head control right here is going to be our main instigator of the stretch and squash. We can do a lot of other things too with him while he's up in the air. We can, if we want his head to stay still, we can make him squash up from his rear. I'll show you what we're going to do with that. But for the initial squash and stretch, we're just going to work with this head control. As he's coming down to the ground, right before the contact point, or honestly, like even at the contact point, we'll give this a try first. Sometimes you want your contact point to actually be the squash frame, but we're going to try the contact point to be the most stretched out frame for starters. So we'll we're going to really exaggerate this because this is a super squishy character and it's going to be a lot of fun. Now, instead of just squashing him like this and pulling him around like that, we're also going to rotate his head because as you're following the motion, you're not, let's see, I don't really have a good example here, but you're not just going to go boop, boop, boop. Like, it's not just straight up and down. Everything has a secondary action. So instead of this chapstick going straight up and down, like so, its whole body, so to speak, is going to be following through on a curve. And then to jump again, the squirrel is going to push himself off. He has to get that motion from somewhere. So we want to make a curve where the whole squirrel's body is following this arc down to the base. And then as he pushes off again, he's leading with his head. He's going forward with his body to give himself that momentum that he needs to come off the ground again. So if we make his contact pose like so, whoops, and then, so this is his takeoff pose again. So I'm going to make sure that both my translation and my rotation are saved there. Me personally, I don't like to use the S key when I'm animating, which the S key will save keyframes on literally every keyable channel that you have available on your selected control. I like to only key translation and or rotation, so that way I don't get all these like weird extra keys for things like on scale, or if you have any sort of set driven keys, you can get some weird stuff for that. So when I am animating, I like to hit Shift W or Shift E as a means to only key on translation or rotation respectively. All right, so when he goes and he takes off here, I'm going to first set all these keys back to 0, so we know what his default position is. But for his takeoff pose, he's got to lead with his head. And you might think, oh, we should go like this, right? Because it's the opposite. It's the backward C to the forward C. Yes, potentially, but in this case, we want this character to basically pull with his head. So he will lean forward at some point, but then he's gonna reach forward. So it's more of an S shape that he's gonna do to take off of the ground. Again, we will take care of other controls later, but for now we're just focusing on this head control. So there's his landing and his takeoff. And then obviously we need the bread and butter of animation of putting in this squash. And we're going to go super squash mode with this. Maybe not quite that much. But there we go. So let's see how that looks. Look at that. It's got a nice little oomph to it. Now, obviously it looks really funny after this point because he's not continuing the stretch and squash. But there you go. That's a very basic squash and then stretch with him leading off. Again, I definitely want to finesse these curves here, or these the silhouettes of the body that's being made. But for now, we're just getting in some really rudimentary stretch and squash. But the thing is, he's coming from high up, where he's not completely stretched out all the way. So at first, at the beginning of our animation, this is going to be a little bit closer to 0. Let's actually go ahead and just 0 this out. But we're going to add a little bit in there. So that way, as he comes down, his head is really kind of hanging back as his rear comes forward. And then once he gets up to this high pose up here, so we can take a look at our graph editor, and if we select the cog control again, the center of gravity, we can look at our translate Y, and that is our high pose, our extreme pose right here. And this is about where he's going to kind of do like a little pendulum thing where his head sort of stays in the air as his rear end swings forward and starts making the trek back down again. So we'll zero out the head once again at this pose. And if you really want to do a quick thing, and I don't like copying and pasting animation keyframes all the time, like as a final solution, but as a quick thing, what we can do here is at his next contact pose, frame 28, we can take the pose from his head at frame 12, and if we middle click drag over to frame 28, since the head control is relative to the center of gravity control, we can just middle click and drag to copy the frame and hit Shift W, Shift E again. And there you go. He's got this pose. Now it's not going to be quite right because he's not going to be quite as stretched out for this second jump. Since he's not coming from as high, it's not going to be exactly how we want. But what we can do here is either we can manually squash him down a little bit, or if you want to, instead of doing that, we can go into the graph editor here and grab his translate Y, translate Z, and the rotate. And that way you can have extreme control over your animation. And once again, obviously we need to have the squash on that frame, but we could do our little copy paste again. So let's see, this is frame 14 to frame, where's he gonna poke up? And notice that we're here. Let's do frame 30. And then we'll have him settle at just 0 for now, as he notices us. There you go. That's some pretty basic stretch and squash there. But one last little thing I'm going to add to this basic jump here is instead of just coming to 0, his rear end is really kind of trailing behind his head. So what we want to do here is I'll save a keyframe on this contact point, and then as he takes off in the air, it's going to really drag behind, so we can add this nice little curve here. And then once he gets up to this passing position, or this top position here, we'll squash him up from the bottom, and then his bottom you can see it's like a little pendulum motion here, and his bottom will come forward again. And I need to make sure, let's zero this out here. And there you go. And that's our basic stretch and squash for the beginning of this jump. Now, obviously, we've got a lot more work to do yet, and we're going to apply this principle to the end of the animation. Plus, we got to give him his little like character of like, oh crap, there's somebody there watching me. And the bread and butter of it all will be the tail at the very end. But that is going to do it for this first video of this animation series. I hope you guys found this helpful in some way or another. And like I said before, if you have any questions, if I didn't explain anything quite thoroughly, or if you want me to elaborate on something completely different than anything I covered here, by all means, please leave a comment down in the section below the video, and I'd be happy to respond to you or make a future video addressing your questions. If you did find this video helpful, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more animation tips and tricks and process videos. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.